Trans children are under attack. Not only have they been neglected by the UK government, but specific members, including the current Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, the person entrusted with their well-being, have come out in support of parents known for abusing their trans children in an attempt to turn them cisgender. This is in spite of that very same government acknowledging that conversion torture, often mislabeled as therapy, constitutes violence and abuse, as we'll see today. But first, a quick content warning for the following: transphobia, anti-Semitism, ableism, medical violence, psychological torture, sexual violence, parental abuse, neglect, and suicide. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that can keep the channel running. We cannot survive without your support. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we need to talk about the fact that the current UK Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, openly expressed support for the Bayswater Support Group, which is made up of parents with a history of abusing their transgender children in a futile attempt to turn them cisgender. This includes a parent who deprived their child of support from a rape crisis centre because the centre was viewed as being trans-affirming. That's the severity of what I mean when I say these parents have a history of abusing their children. Today's video largely owes its existence to the work of two journalists, Sasha Baker, they, them, and Valerie Rocca, she, her. The pair not only helped to expose the group in question, publishing two separate exposés to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in 2024, but recently brought to light video footage of Wes Streeting publicly supporting said group during the elections that year, publishing said video as part of an article on Queer AF.
Balance right is really important, and people can see in Labour's manifesto the commitment to an inclusive conversion therapy ban, also unequivocal support for the CAS review too, which I think is an evidence-based, well-researched, well-considered report. And if we get those recommendations fully implemented, I think it will be transformational actually for young people and their families who've really struggled with these issues, who are stuck on waiting lists, who are struggling to get access to care, and in some cases have often felt cut out of the conversation. I think particularly families, having met with Bayswater parents, I think that's been I'd go as far as say traumatic experience for some of those families, and that's really stuck with me. Similarly for trans young people as well, being stuck on waiting lists, not being able to see a mental health professional, not knowing what's going to happen. This is a status quo that's not worked for anyone, and we've got to get this right. It's so important, especially where it concerns children and young people.
Now, there's a few things to point out, starting with how the video began well. The Labour Party pledging to introduce an inclusive conversion therapy ban, that is to say, one that wouldn't have exemptions for certain groups or practices, was a glimmer of hope many held going in. Of course, we're no longer in the election cycle, Labour has gone back on the vast majority of their promises, and this is one of them. For whilst it still claims to fully accept the fact that, quote, conversion practices are abuse, end quote, it goes on to assert that such a ban, quote, must not cover legitimate psychological support, treatment, or non-directive counselling, end quote, as if that were ever in question, and that it must, quote, respect the important role that teachers, religious leaders, parents, and carers can have in supporting those exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity, end quote. Both of these passages suggest that the current government plans to include exemptions, allowing abusive parents to carry on, as we'll see today. As for the CAS review, we've already done multiple videos debunking said non-peer-reviewed hate pamphlet, its many methodological flaws, its outright lies about pre-existing research, as well as the author's known conflict of interest going in, like in our video J.K. Rowling Caught Lying About Trans Children, specifically the chapter titled The Pseudoscientific Pamphlet That Refuses to Die Already. We then revisited the consequences of said report in our video, Trans Children Speak Out Against Deadly Puberty Blocker Ban, specifically the chapter titled The CAS Review Scandal and the Tavistock 16. The Tavistock 16 are the 16 children killed, driven to suicide as a result of a temporary suspension of gender-affirming care within the NHS, deaths that both the Tory and Labour government have attempted to hide, with the Tories introducing a new temporary ban just as the 2024 election was called, a ban which Wes Streeting has since made permanent. We also discussed the fact that, shortly before making the ban permanent, desperate trans children, the very people impacted, met with Wes Streeting, bringing attention to said deaths, leaving absolutely zero deniability behind Wes Streeting's actions. Streeting chose medical violence against a marginalised community, fully aware of the deadly consequences of his actions. So if you like details, I suggest checking out those videos. They are fully referenced, as always. Which finally brings us to the Bayswater parents Streeting mentioned, which refers to the Bayswater Support Group. Said group claims that it seeks to, quote, help parents feel less isolated, to provide the tools to advocate for their child in school and within health services, and to help parents to hear and understand their child's distress, end quote. Which seems noble enough. Sadly, as is all too common, this is merely a front, a fact revealed when we take a look at the Bayswater Discord server, as discussed in the first article. Inside the server, parents openly ask for therapists to help them force their child to be cisgender, with one parent stating that, quote, I did some research and became gender critical in my outlook maybe 3 years ago. My wife resisted but has recently peaked and joined the resistance. Can anyone recommend a therapist who doesn't just affirm gender identity? End quote. The entire notion that a child's gender must be controlled, that they can be forced to be cisgender with or without the help of a therapist, is abuse in and of itself. That is why a 2019 Trevor Project US survey found that, whilst LGBT+ youth who had never had someone try to convince them to change their gender or sexuality had an attempted suicide rate of 8% in the last year, which is actually 1% lower than the national average, this number almost tripled to 23% in those who had someone try to convince them to change their gender or sexuality. Let me be clear, this only refers to attempts to convince a person to change their gender or sexuality. This is not organized clinical conversion torture, often mislabeled therapy, the very same that this parent seems to be after, which increased attempted suicide from 8% to 42% among all LGBT+ youth, reaching a staggering 57% for trans youth specifically. That's a 5 to 7-fold increase. There is no reason to think that this will be any different for the UK, ergo, there is no way to justify said abusive behaviour at all. And that's before we even come to the fact that not a single person has ever had their sexuality or gender changed. They might be forced back into the closet, but that's it. You cannot change a person's gender or sexuality, which, along with the harm said methods cause, is why various medical institutions, such as the UK Council for Psychotherapy, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the US Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and India's National Medical Commission, all agree that conversion practices are unethical. The parents of the server also admit to trying to sever their child's ability to access the internet and the wider trans community in an attempt to control their gender, with one parent confessing that, quote, I knew the internet was a major factor in my child's gender identity, so I famously drowned their iPhone in a jug of salty sugar water whilst they were in the shower one day. End quote. Another parent used the threat of no electronics to control what their child wore, specifically their binder, admitting that, quote, I told them to go and get their phone, laptop and tablet, and that they weren't getting them back until they would give up their binder. End quote. both of which are horrific and abusive displays of power. To sever a child's connection to their wider community, particularly at a time like now in which trans children are being bombarded with so much hate, we've literally seen a 1,282% increase in anti-trans hate crimes within the UK, is dangerous. Which is to say nothing of threatening to do so unless a child gives up their binder, making them pick between comfort within their own body and their community. Another parent noted they'd been reported to social services by a school counsellor because, quote, "My child is fearful living in our home. We have refused to buy them certain boys' clothes and we restrained them," end quote. They then later followed up, adding how the child was, quote, "not concerned that mum and dad had been referred to social services," end quote, clearly demonstrating the impact such abusive behaviour has on a child, making said child fearful of their own home. This is not said behaviour might lead to distress. We know for a fact that the children of these parents have already been made to suffer. Another stated that they were denying their child support for potential ADHD and autism, declaring that, quote, "When they fully identify as a woman, then we can look at autism and ADHD. Until then, I am steering clear of therapist, and I am one," end quote. Though perhaps the most horrific confession came from the parent, and I am using that term broadly, who admitted that, quote, "I can't get my child much support for their sexual assault because, would you believe it, our local rape crisis offers the affirmation model," end quote. What can I say about this? As a trans person who was also raped as a child and had her entire life thrown into disarray due to the subsequent PTSD, the idea of a parent, a caregiver, denying their child access to resources meant to help them heal, I'm at a loss for words. Monstrous, grotesque, abusive. They don't fucking cut it. None of them do. This child is being forced to suffer the long-term consequences of rape without support, on top of gender dysphoria, all because their DNA donor hates trans people to such a degree that any trans-inclusive space is deemed the enemy. Yet said scum has the gall to pretend like they're actually trying to help their child, acting exasperated as if it's the Rape Crisis Centre's fault for not tossing trans people out on the street. And just so we're clear, members of the group are aware that what they are doing is abuse. When one user posted a link to an article about anti-LGBT+ domestic abuse, noting how, quote, "examples include monitoring interaction with friends. Imagine it also includes refusal to affirm," end quote. Another parent sarcastically responded with, quote, "yes, we are abusive," end quote, to which the original commenter replied, quote, "one day they might thank us for that abuse," end quote, clearly acknowledging and subsequently mocking the fact that what they're doing constitutes domestic abuse. Meanwhile, a Bayswater committee member, so someone who quite literally runs the group, confessed that their own child, now an adult, was living in accommodation for LGBT+ survivors of abuse, which they labelled as a, quote, "church for the gender faithful," end quote, mocking the desperate situation they put their child in. And if all this isn't enough to convince you that the Bayswater group is aware of what it is doing, their suggested website block list, on top of including charities such as Mermaids and Stonewall, includes Childline, the official counselling service operated by the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. That on its own should be enough to condemn every single member of said group. Any parent which follows its advice and blocks said website is, in my mind, confessing to the intent to abuse their children. There is no other reason for blocking said website. Sadly, the Bayswater Group has largely been enabled by the UK government. Keeping to the same article, the Crown Prosecution Service used to list quote-unquote destroying medication as an example of abuse in its guidance. This was changed to quote, destroying UK regulated medication that has been prescribed to the victim, end quote, in May of 2024. Said change removed the destruction of non-prescribed medication, including DIY HRT, as abuse at a time in which trans youth cannot get support through the NHS, private is too costly, they clearly don't have supportive parents to help them pay for that, so DIY becomes a last resort for many trans people. Though, one thing I need to make absolutely clear, this is merely guidance, suggestions on what judges and social workers within the UK should follow. It is not law, and said institutions can choose to challenge it. Such guidelines require them to be tested and upheld in court in order to set case precedent. The reason I need to make this absolutely clear is because I've seen too many trans people framing CPS guidance as actual law, which is the exact opposite of what we need to do. Do not obey in advance. If you go around claiming that this guidance or the guidelines on rape by deception are law, that can be taken as evidence that both sides are in agreement, meaning there is no challenge. It is imperative that those of us reporting on these topics do so in full context and that we, as a community, make as much noise and challenge said guidelines wherever possible. That said, the Bayswater Group thanks CPS for the changes since it gave them some protection in abusing their children. If such a case were to go to court, they'd be able to cite said guidance, offering their actions a sense of legitimacy. As for where the change came from, CPS later admitted that the change had been introduced upon advice from the Bayswater Group, who argued that DIY HRT was dangerous, ignoring how trans youth are forced to seek it out thanks to their neglect. This is worth pointing out since the Bayswater Group hates to be labelled as a lobbying group as seen in the second article, even though there's actual evidence of them influencing government policy. Speaking of the second article, it contains more examples of the Bayswater Group doing just that, with them having been at the forefront of policy changes seeking to exclude any acknowledgement of trans people from relationship, sex and health education, or RSHE, as well as force schools to out children to their parents. And to help them achieve this, they've turned to a British MP, Miriam Cates. Miriam Cates is a particularly vile individual I'd intended to cover in a forgotten 2023 video about the fact that 32% of the British public believe in the Great Replacement Conspiracy, i.e., quote, the idea that white Americans and Europeans are being replaced by non-white immigrants, end quote. This is often presented as the machinations of a global order of Jewish elite, often referred to via anti-Semitic dog whistles such as globalist, dual loyalist, Frankfurter, and cultural Marxist. And it was that last one, cultural Marxist, that Cates herself used at the time, asserting that, quote, because liberal individualism has proven to be completely powerless to resist the cultural Marxism that is systematically destroying our children's souls. When culture, schools and universities openly teach that our country is racist, our heroes are villains, humanity is killing the earth, you are what you desire, diversity is theology, boundaries are tyranny, and self-restraint is oppression? Is it any wonder that mental health conditions, self-harm and suicide, and epidemic levels of anxiety and confusion characterize the emerging generation? End quote. This led her to be called out by Lord Mann, the government's anti-Semitism czar, who acknowledged that said language was inseparable from, quote, conspiracy theory with anti-Semitism at its core, end quote. I just want to apologise, particularly to my Jewish, Muslim and UK immigrant audience, for never finishing that video. I was working through some personal stuff at the time, which led to a lot of videos being delayed and subsequently forgotten as a result. For that, I am sorry. Would you still like a video on this topic, perhaps reframed as the time everyone just ignored this bombshell of a statistic? Do let me know in the comments. Returning to Kate's, if you couldn't tell by her remark of "you are what you desire," her many victims include trans children, with her arguing that any child learning about the existence of trans people constitutes active harm. One of the narratives she presented at a parliamentary debate regarding RSHE was an all too familiar trope, with her asserting that, quote, "One parent of a 15-year-old with a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome said she discovered that, without her knowledge, her child's school has started the process of socially transitioning her child and has continued to do so despite the mother's objections," end quote. With the insinuation here being that a child's autism makes them susceptible to the apparent harms of trans-inclusive schooling, or that being autistic invalidates a child's identity. This is based on the thoroughly ableist assumption that autistic people are simple-minded fools and are thus easily duped. That, due to rigid thinking, we see society's ridiculous gender stereotypes, realize that we don't align with those associated with our birth assigned gender, and thus conclude that we must be the opposite gender. Except, science has shown us the exact opposite, with one paper stating that, quote, "The finding that non-binary identities are most elevated seems to support hypotheses focused on autistic resistance to social conditioning, which are consistent with existing evidence of the same effect with respect to self-description of sexual orientation. Perhaps elevated rates of trans identity in autism might result from a rejection of the binary cisgenderist norm, which, combined with a below-typical concern for social norms, could promote the disclosure of the identity." End quote. To clarify what they meant by elevated, the study found that 94% of autistic trans people in its sample were non-binary, meaning they did not adhere to societal stereotypes of either masculinity or femininity, but rejected them completely. So the assumption that autistic people are easily manipulated by social norms and peer influence flies in the face of everything we know, relying entirely on ableist attitudes towards the neurodivergent that present us as subhuman as justification for the removal of our rights, including bodily autonomy and self-identity. What's particularly interesting about Kate's claim, however, is that it perfectly lines up with a request posted to the Bayswater group the day before, a post which asked, quote, "Does anyone have the experience of their autistic child identifying as trans following learning about it at school? Ideally a situation where the school went on to transition the child." End quote. And indeed, both the Bayswater group and Kate's have referenced each other on multiple occasions, with one parent inside the Bayswater group stating that, quote, "I spoke with Miriam Kates. She's keen to get parents' testimony of the goings-on within the school for Natim Sahari, then the Education Secretary, to instigate an investigation." End quote. Then, in April of 2024, Kates announced that, quote, "I pay tribute to the brave parents, including those in the Bayswater Support Group who have been raising concerns for years about the ethics and safety of putting vulnerable children on irreversible and unevidenced medical pathways," end quote, clearly praising said child abusers. Sadly, Kate has had a lot of success with her fear-mongering, pushing the UK further and further away from acceptance of LGBT+ people, including LGBT+ children. The article rightfully goes on to compare what Kate's and Bayswater are attempting to Section 28, the horrific law that was introduced in 1988, banning any positive mention of LGBT+ people in official institutions, such as schools, only being repealed in 2003. And even then, it wasn't until 2019 that the UK saw official guidance mandating that all English schools teach about LGBT+ identities, the very same year Cates came into office and the Bayswater Group was founded. There are further connections included within the article, and I definitely suggest giving it a read, same with the previous article. Both are incredible pieces of journalism. But we finally come back to where we began, with Wes Streeting and his words of sympathy for this hate group made up of abusive parents, stating that,
I think particularly families, having met with Bayswater parents, I think that's been I'd go as far as say traumatic experience for some of those families, and that's really stuck with me.
He is not talking about the trauma these children have been put through in being stripped of their community, their bodily autonomy, and hell, even their right to seek therapy after being raped. He is framing the anger of these abusive parents in being unable to force their child to be cisgender, no matter how much they torture them, as the real issue. Now, if you've been paying any sort of attention to Wes Streeting and the way he treats trans youth, as shown in our video, Trans Children Speak Out Against Deadly Puberty Blocker Ban, this likely doesn't come as a surprise. Streeting has shown us time and time again that any claim to want to listen to the trans children being harmed by his government's actions are nothing but hollow platitudes, an assertion repeated ad nauseum as a means of deflecting from his personal responsibility in recreating a situation which is quite literally killing them. That said, I do have to acknowledge the fact that this video was recorded the month before the exposés were published, meaning there is a possibility that Streeting was unaware of what he was supporting. That noted, the fact that he has made no effort whatsoever to distance himself from the Bayswater Group, let alone apologize to their victims or flag said group to social services, the social services he is the head of, coupled with his continued attacks on trans youth, I am unwilling to give him the benefit of the doubt. Wes Streeting has burnt away any and all goodwill he might have once had, meaning I can only assume that he sympathized with said abusive group because he was aware of what they were doing and supports them in their goals. For as horrific as it was, nothing on that server was actually surprising. Heartbreaking, yes, but if you have any idea as to how anti-LGBT+ groups and parents operate, not genuinely shocking. There's no way a part of Wes Streeting wasn't aware of what they were about when he invited them to talk to him regarding the permanent ban on puberty blockers, being one of 8 anti-trans hate groups which took part in a public consultation that was launched in August, months after the exposés had been published. A consultation which, in spite of only 27% of those consulted supporting said ban, with 59% opposing it, Streeting still went ahead with the ban, claiming to have majority support. One group particularly frustrated by Streeting's actions are Trans Kids Deserve Better, who told Queer AF that, quote, "It is frankly diabolical that groups like Bayswater and GenSpect, an international gender-critical group opposing gender affirmation, were given more regard in the consultation to permanently ban puberty blockers as opposed to transgender children, the people the ban directly affects." End quote. And yeah, you have to give it to them, they're spot on. By the way, if you'd like to hear more from Trans Kids Deserve Better, we've got a video reading out testimonials from its members, specifically regarding another anti-trans hate group, the LGBT Alliance. So if you'd like to hear more from the children directly impacted by said medical violence, I suggest checking out that video. All revenue from that video was donated directly to Trans Kids Deserve Better. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the Bayswater Group? How do we best protect trans youth from their violence? What are your thoughts on Miriam Cates? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Goddess a Lighter, Soshula Wayne 6 Denials, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.